Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Lauer from Project ARC. Many of you know me from my work in the space where I've tried to really push project-based learning into more of an authentic approach to learning in the classroom, so that our learners just have that opportunity to affect real change in their world. In fact, the Project ARC piece of it stands for authenticity, relevancy, and community connected learning. So I've been in this space for a little more than 20 years now, and it's really been my passion, and the journey has mostly been rewarding, but at times bumpy. And it was nearly a year ago, and it's hard to believe it's been a year. In November of 2024, I put out this call on LinkedIn to connect with me if you considered yourself to be disagreeable in education. And the post really itself was prompted by a book that I was reading at the time that lo and behold, Stefanie, I think you were the one that recommended it to me, quite perhaps. But it comes from Adam Grant's New York Times bestseller, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. So I'll take a moment and read the quote to you. And it says, the ideal members of a challenged network are disagreeable because they're fearless about questioning the way things have always been done and holding us accountable for thinking again. There's evidence that disagreeable people speak up more frequently, especially when leaders aren't receptive, and foster more task conflict. They give the critical feedback we might not want to hear, but need to hear. And out of that quote, I went to Tim and said, I don't know. I've got all of these people that are connecting with me on LinkedIn that said that they're disagreeable in the education space. What should we do? And out of that, DisEd was born. So I had no idea what DisEd would turn into. And in fact, I have no idea what our guests are going to say today as the conversation unfolds over the next 35 or 40 minutes. Hopefully, there will be some disagreements as we engage in conversation, but I must add our disclaimer that our guest viewpoints don't necessarily constitute an endorsement from Project ARC. Instead, Tim and I really want to learn and grow as we think again.
All right. Thank you, Dana, for that introduction. My name is Tim Kubik, and I am Dana's longtime thought partner at Project ARC and have had a long career in community-connected education going back to my first teaching experiences in West Africa. I'm really excited to introduce our guests today, as both of them are engaged in stretching our brains. And so I think this will be a good conversation. Our first guest, Stefanie Faye, is a neuroscience researcher with a focus on application of neuroscience principles and also has a highly successful podcast and has done consulting with many major organizations over the course of her career. Our other guest, Drew Perkins, Dana and I have known for quite a while. Drew was a national faculty member with us at the Buck Institute for Education back in the day, and now has his own education consulting business called Thought Stretchers. We're excited to have them both here, and I'm going to toss it over to Stefanie to share a word that begins with dis that might make you disagreeable in education today. And then we'll hear from Drew. Stefanie, take it away.
Well, I played with quite a few words. It really was a tie between two, but I'm going to go with disillusioned. I'm sure many people have maybe even already used that word on this podcast. And very specifically with the idea of simple answers. My other dis word was actually discovering, and very specifically about complexity. So the idea that the disillusioned for me comes from seeing people get a hold of different concepts or frameworks or ideas, wanting to see them create change in whatever organization they are, often in schools, but in other areas, and then discovering that there is no quick fix to complexity. And human beings are very complex creatures, and there's a lot of different factors that continuously emerge in whatever we're doing that make simple things very difficult. So,
Almost a
yes.
third dis word, but not quite. I know difficult should be a word, but it's not. But thank you. And two words are certainly okay, Drew. If you want to jump in and offer one or two, there's nothing wrong with that. And then there's also absolutely nothing wrong if we hear a word that we've heard before, like disillusioned, Stephanie, because I think that word means a lot of different things to different people. And you offered a
Mm.
nice articulation of it. So, Drew, over to you, a dis word for us or two.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation and some of the things that Stefanie said, I'm sure will be interesting to intersect with. But the word that I came up with, and I'm happy to unpack it, but discover or discovery maybe. One of the things that I have engaged a lot in over the last several years as part of my podcast is conversations with cognitive scientists and neuroscientists and people really trying to get to some of that complexity, get away from those simple answers. And one of the, I guess, paradigms that I find to be troublesome, and there's lots of tentacles to it, but the sort of conflation of inquiry, teaching, and learning as discovery. So that's why I picked discovery.
All right. Well, I think this is the first match that we've had in terms of words in the 9 episodes of the podcast, but it's an interesting one, right? First off, because so many of the dis words that we hear are negative, right? Um, but discovery is, relatively speaking, a more positive term, right? Unless we're talking about Columbus, we won't go there, right? Um, the idea of discovery, and what I love that both of you shared, is this connection with challenging the simple answers. Because I think a lot of times in education, we get less labeled disagreeable because we see the complexity where others just want the simple answer. Did you get the answer right or wrong? Not the gray area in between. Um, did you articulate the thesis correctly or incorrectly? Right? Not how might we give you some feedback that makes it better? I'm curious, whichever one of you wants to jump in first on that question of complexity as you see it, and then I might jump in with another angle as well. But I want to hear from both of you first. Tell me about complexity of discovery. What are we really talking about there?
Well, I'm happy to jump in unless
Sure.
Stephanie, you want?
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
take
Yeah,
turns.
so one of the things that I again push for often is that nuance and complexity. And a lot of times I see stuff on social media, for example, people making claims and simple claims, right? The simplicity of it is that if you do explicit instruction and build knowledge, then it'll lead to curiosity or something like that.
Mhm.
And again, the conflation of discovery as inquiry-based learning, I think, is just an incredibly simple version of it. So my push and advocacy in that realm is to say, let's look at the things that we can take away from cognitive science and, you can say science of learning, the explicit and traditional kind of teaching modes that I think are important to recognize. And I think that progressive education, constructivist education has made some mistakes in that realm, sort of dismissing those kinds of things, but then not having those folks dismiss the importance of and the ways in which inquiry can show up in just a variety of different ways, right? It can be a framing effect, it can be an assessment effect, it can be something that captures engagement and interest and motivates kids, it can unpack curiosity. I mean, there's so many different ways that inquiry can show up that are not simple, but are really, really complex. And sometimes it might look like discovery, but it doesn't have to. And so, really trying to get educators uh, from either end of that spectrum to recognize and acknowledge the complexity of the way that teaching and learning actually happens in classrooms and not just in some research paper in some lab or, some version of that.
No, and I have to say, Drew, that's one of the things that I enjoy about your posts that I see on LinkedIn and some of your conversations is you're pushing that notion that inquiry is far more diverse, right? Or
Mm.
far more complex than just being engaged in asking questions, right? But you've also referenced some work with cognitive science, and we've got a neuroscientist in the room. So unpack it for us as a neuroscientist, right? What is complexity meaning for you, Stephanie?
Well, I'd love to share something about brainwaves that I think is really relevant and to me kind of exciting, which is that, you were talking about a little bit in the beginning of when we have these simplistic answers or frameworks, there's this idea of I did it right or wrong, or there's an outcome that's supposed to happen, or
Mhm.
you do this and then you get that. And what's interesting with when it comes to how we frame, and you talked about that too, Drew, framing, there are different ways that we approach, for example, feedback. And feedback can be a critique, something negative. It can be a bad score, a bad result.
Mhm.
And depending on our appraisal of it and the mindset, the paradigm that we have, they're actually testing what that does to our brain as we receive this information. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Carol Dweck and growth mindset. And her original wording, actually, her original research had to do with incremental theory or entity theory. And so, entity theory being that things are fixed and there really is this finite amount and it's an either or. Incrementalism, incremental theory being that everything is upgradable, updatable, learnable, acquirable in some way. And so people who have more of a incremental theory of skill, ability, intelligence, when they make a mistake or they perceive that they got negative feedback or incorrect score, whatever it is, their brains, first of all, they get this heightened wave that shows they're very, very aware that there is something called a prediction error. So we predict that this could be right or wrong, and then there's an error in that pattern. When they when this prediction error occurs, someone who has this incremental kind of mindset, it's almost like the brain wakes up, pays very close attention, and then starts to engage in a very sustained amount of deep processing, deep semantic connecting of dots. And they find that the post-test performance ends up improving quite a bit,
Mhm.
and their gain in knowledge is very high. And that's in contrast to someone who has that entity type of theory where it's right or wrong, it's this or that, and there's almost like a threat to the identity of that person. And that's kind of what gets reported as well. Their brain has a little bit it has the awareness that the prediction error occurred, but then disengages from any kind of deep processing of the information. Then when they get tested later, there is no retention of knowledge because it's like the brain saw that something was off, but shut down and did not want to engage in the information that it could extract from that. So I feel like that's a way to talk about complexity is this constant opening up to information and allowing it to pull on threads and dance and weave with all the other
Mhm.
information we have. And that's different to a simplistic kind of framing of the world where it's this or that, and I will shut down if it's not that. So
No,
it's
that's
kind of
really
how I would
helpful,
frame it.
Stephanie. And I just want to check in with Drew there. It sounds kind of like that's what you were talking about when you mentioned the role that inquiry plays in assessment, right? Am I in the ballpark there for you, Drew, or you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, yeah, there are so many ways in which inquiry can show up and should show up, and we want it to show up.
Mhm.
And Stephanie, as you were talking, one of the things that I was thinking about is the idea of retrieval practice. And of course, cognitive science and science of learning people tend to really hammer away at retrieval practice because if you say, I think it's Daniel Willingham that says,
Mhm.
learning is a change in long-term memory. Which I think is one way to characterize learning. I think there's more complexity to it. There's other things that we want to consider there. And the ways that I think about inquiry being a really powerful tool to engage people's, neurons and
Mhm.
thinking in ways that actually can be really powerful retrieval practice that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with flashcards or those kinds of retrieval practice kinds of things. But if you say, what is it? I think it's Daniel Willingham again, that I think it's memory is the residue of thinking or something like that, then the more ways in which you think about things, the more likely you are to retrieve it. And so it doesn't, I mean, it stands to reason to me, very intuitively so, that the more ways you can do that, I mean, inquiry is a way to engage different thoughts and ways to do it. And if somebody's curious, I think to your point, Stephanie, is then you've got maybe more receptiveness, or I'm not using probably the technical terms that you might be using and writing about and your vernacular. So, that's maybe how I mean, again, that's what I was thinking when you were talking. That's interesting.
Yeah, and we've got this interesting tension surfacing, I think, here between Drew, you called it receptiveness, and Stephanie described the opposite as another dis word, disengagement or
Mm.
disengaged, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
Um, and I know, I think we're all somewhat familiar with Dweck's work, some probably more so than others. But I know that it was something that when we founded Project Arc, and Dana, you're welcome to chime in this if you want to, right? We made growth a really central part of what we were trying to offer for learners and for teachers, right? And that's part of what made us disagreeable. Like our homepage on our initial website just had a woman who sort of looked like Dana with the word grow on it in big letters after it, right? And people are like, but I just want to know how to do this right, right? And so we got this sort of critique for asking too much. And Dana, if you want to share an anecdote about that, because I want to get back to this question of um, uh, disengagement,
Hmm.
and Drew, you have to remind me of your word because I forgot it already. That you
Discovery.
not discovery, but there was another word you just used not too long ago. But it's
Retreat.
okay. Was the opposite of disengagement, right? It was retrieval, like retrieval or memory, something along those lines. But Dana, do you want to chime in somewhat on this resistance to growth that we find in education that makes some of us get labeled disagreeable?
Yeah, Tim and I often go back to the example from, it has probably been close to 10 years ago where I was with a group of administrators who, listened to my presentation, participated, had an assistant principal come up to me afterwards and say, "Do you want to come and work for me? Do you want to come and teach for me?" And I was like, "No, no, 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 I don't want to come and teach for you." And he said, "Well, but the thing of it is, Dana, I would just be happy if my teachers went from the column where they were doing all the talking to let's just do little, discovery type activities. What you want them to do, that's an awful lot. I don't know. I think that that's too complicated. And so looking at it from that position of you've got to give them the steps to build it, which can be quite complicated, versus allowing them to uncover and discover the complexity that surrounds it, and knowing that if you support the teachers in the right way, you can get them to that space and place where then they are ready to facilitate those learning experiences for their students, whatever grade level content area it is. And until we can do that, how many students become disillusioned with the educational process and get labeled as troublemakers, or they don't want to come to school, or they're the really good kids who just sit and nod their head and shake and say, you know what, I've done my retrieval practice, I've done my Quizlets or whatever the flavor of the day is in terms of ed tech, and I know all the right answers, and just give me the right answers because I want to make the grade. And so it's a really interesting kind of cycle that has been perpetuated for so many decades. And the disagreement, I think, comes about with what how do we make those shifts and how do we make those changes so that administrators are ready, teachers are ready, students are ready, and even parents are ready for it.
Well, and I'm glad you raised that opposition between complicated and complex, right? Because I think that's part of the disagreement, right? I think when teachers encounter complexity, sort of the curiosity, the innovation that arises from learners who are engaged in learning and asking new questions and trying to go in different directions, they often see that it makes their job more complicated. And I'm curious whether either one of you wants to pick up on that. Why are people who are used to looking for simple answers, why do they tend to translate complexity into complications? What's at issue there that makes those of us who want to celebrate the complexity seem too complicated to work with? Any thoughts?
Oh, so many thoughts.
Okay,
Yeah,
go
go
for
ahead.
it.
I have some too. Go ahead.
Well, I have sort of maintained for some time, and I'll try to make this soapbox speech a little short, is that was it 1983, A Nation at Risk, sort of set us on a course of much more, answers and accountability and getting
Mhm.
tests right and that kind of thing. And to me, one of the things that did was disincentivize the kind of inquiry teaching that sort of empowers and builds and grows the sort of skills that are what I would say are inquiry skills, and that kind of mindset seeks complexity, seeks nuance, looks for answers, and says, "Is that right? Is that how might that be right? Is that actually true?" And a variety of different kinds of questions that might surface from that. So I think that civics education is something that could help really do this, sort of leaning into the Enlightenment liberal civic and intellectual traditions,
Mhm.
which I think is an inquiry project in and of itself, which could, I think, help us with some of the culture war and depolarization kind of things. But again, that's a whole different soapbox, town square kind of diatribe. But the thing that I think teachers really benefit from, and it's so hard to do in professional development, professional learning settings, and in schools just in general, which is to have deep reflective conversations and play with ideas. And when somebody makes an assertion or there's a new piece of research, I say, okay, is that right? What do we think about that? Let's make meaning of that, right?
Mhm.
So there's a difference between a first order reality, which is what I might think of something, but the second order reality is the meaning you make of something. If I'm the teacher and this is the set of knowledge, right? How do we make meaning of things and how do we have those conversations? It's certainly really helpful to do, a project-based learning workshop or, an assessment workshop. But I've found that the ways that we can get teachers to play with ideas and really think deeply and have those kinds of conversations, which is really challenging given all the
Mhm.
logistics. To me, that's the mileage there is really, really efficient, I guess.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Stephanie, either piggyback on that or tell us a little bit about why you think that the complexity of discovery is often seen as too complicated for the classroom or
Yeah,
the boardroom
yeah.
for that matter, right?
Yeah, I mean, the couple of words, disengagement is still up there
Yeah.
for me as important to talk about. And I would say that I think that there's this illusion that if something is, there's a simple formula, you do this and you get that result. There's an illusion that there will be less effort and it's more controllable.
Mhm.
And what I mean, I think we all know is more true is that there is, although that can have this mirage, that or illusion that it's going to be more simple, because complexity is the name of the game. It's what we live within. When we apply formulas and they don't work, the amount of effort that goes into trying to figure out another formula and then the loss of motivation and interest that then ends up happening and the disappointment and the discouragement are so exhausting that that ends up being a really, I'll just say exhausting again, route to go down. So in terms of even just when it comes to our brains, our nervous systems, how we learn, adaptation is what is actually the real outcome. That is what we're looking for. It's constant adaptation. And although, like, I think that a lot of teachers feel exhausted to think about that because it's like, but then I don't have the go-to thing anymore.
Hmm.
But the truth is that we actually get better in terms of how our brains optimize what to do here, what to do here, when we have that become more of the paradigm that we're working within. And a metaphor that I like to use is there's these structures in Peru that have withstood earthquakes, and they have as their foundation these rolling boulders.
Hmm.
And so I like to kind of look at it like, although there's less, like they have these rolling boulders, their foundation is very adaptable.
Hmm.
It seems less sturdy and less secure in a way, but they have withstood these earthquakes because of that ability to do that. So it looks like it's going to not work because you have too many moving parts,
Hmm.
literally.
Yep.
But actually, that is what makes it withstand because it can roll with what's happening in the environment. So it's yeah, it's just this disconnect with this idea, and I think because our brains are energy conserving machines, like that's what they want. It always wants to be
Yeah.
predictive. They're predictive more than they are reactive. They want to be able to predict, not want. Our brain doesn't want, but that's the name of the algorithm. It's an energy conserving. So
Hmm.
we will always default towards what is the least amount of energy expenditure possible. That's kind of where we default. And it takes energy and conversation and new perspectives to give the brain some feedback that there's a longer term projection we need to play with in terms of energy conservation, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. What is good for the short term might actually be very energy draining in the long term.
No, and I think that takes us back to Drew's comments about accountability, and teacher evaluation and assessment, right? In that, um, because we're still tied to this notion that students should develop sort of sequentially in unison based on their age, right? And that if they're not doing that, then we have to remediate. That's another question I wanted to ask, but we have this very short-term focus, right? Are they reading by third grade? If not, here comes a lot of remediation, here comes a lot of response. Are they able to do algebra by middle school? If not, here comes a lot of mediation and a lot of response because they're not on track. And you talked about discouragement, Stefanie. And
Mhm.
what I'm wondering is we're starting to head toward the early end of, not the very end, but the early end of our conversation. What I'm wondering is, I'm trying to think how to articulate it. I guess what I'm wondering is that discouragement that, and Drew phrased it as something slightly different, um, that learners encounter when their long-term learning butts up against the short-term learning, right? The pressures of short-term learning and the accountability that the system really drives. Um, I mean, Drew talked about conversations, right, as a way to get around that. That instead of trying to teach people short-term solutions, do this and get that, being better at conversations. I'm wondering if the
Mhm.
three of you would like to have a little conversation about how we get through the discouragement of being told you have to hold off your long-term learning in order to meet these short-term goals to prove that you're on track and that teachers are accountable. I'm just throwing it open because it's a really deep and interesting question, right? That all of us face as teachers when we run into students who are basically like, but I want to know where this goes. And we're like, well, we don't have time for that.
Mm.
Some thoughts. And
Yeah,
Dana, feel free to jump in if you want to too.
this is one of the things that I tend to be disagreeable with on the science of learning, with the science of learning folks is, or at least a question, right? So
Mhm.
when we talk about things like retrieval practice and change in long-term memory and the things that, and there's a spectrum, right? You might see choral teaching, which is, certainly much more sort of controlling and compliance and that kind of thing. Um, but all of these sort of behaviorist kinds of moves of like, if this, then that, right?
Mhm.
Stefanie, you're kind of referring to that, right? If we do this amount of explicit instruction and do it exactly this way, formulaically, the students will get the answers right, which doesn't mean that they understand it.
Hmm.
And I think they make a mistake there. One of my questions is, okay, so how durable is that knowledge that they are reporting? But also, what are you doing with it, right? What are the next steps, and how do we get them to think more deeply and again, sort of make meaning and do the things that move them from, I like Hattie's surface, deep, and transfer, right? So
Hmm.
move from that surface to the deep to the transfer, and really engage in rich, thoughtful experiences. And I I don't see evidence. I mean, surely they value those things, but
Hmm.
I don't see evidence of them doing it. So I'm like, so tell me, I don't know if you are familiar with Oliver Caviglioli, but he's does a lot of really great graphics work in the science of learning books and stuff like that. Super, super thoughtful. And one of my conversations, he said something to the effect of, they tend to be asking the question, how do we get students to have this knowledge or something like that? But they're not asking, what if we could get students to have this knowledge, right? So
Right.
that
Mm.
then what, right? And those are the kinds of experiences and things that I think, and I know Tim and Dana, you both value and like, how do we engage them in authentic, relevant, I'm sorry, what's
Community connected.
the C?
Although
Yeah, the community.
interestingly, it used to be complexity, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We
Mm.
got dissed for
But
that.
Right.
So
teachers feel that's too complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, that's kind of what made me think
Mm.
of.
yeah, Stefanie, how to handle that discouragement with a young and developing brain where there's a short-term pressure from the education system to say you know it or you don't, or you
Hmm.
did it or you didn't, right? Versus,
Yeah,
yeah, I can do this now. I want to see if I can do X, Y, and Z too, right? How do we handle that discouragement?
yeah. Well, I think Drew mentioned like the word short. I forgot it. It's another dis
Nobody
word.
can
Too
remember
many
my
dis
words.
words.
I don't understand
Um,
it.
but oh, meaning, making meaning.
Making meaning.
I
Yeah.
think that yes, like there is juice that's needed. The brain has to feel excited. It has to feel personally meaningful. There's different levels of meaningfulness that get the brain to actually kind of open up, and one of them is a deeper sense of identity, and how not just how useful something is, but how it allows me to have some sort of identity. And I think that there is a way to tap into the short term, but it has to be accompanied with, like, this spaced retrieval practice. A kid, if they don't care what it is they're learning about, it doesn't matter what kind of theory or framework or strategy you use, it doesn't mean anything to them, and they don't see how it's ever going to mean anything to them. So I think that idea of meaning and making things meaningful,
Mhm.
I do think it's possible to do that even in a short-term setting, but it requires that kind of conversation, that perspective, and the thought and care that would go into that, like that personal the personal meaningfulness, I think, is a really big part of not just for the students, but for the teachers
Hmm.
to understand, what is this about my identity that I also get to make meaningful about trying this idea out? Like, how do I expand my identity as who I am as a human being and what I'm
Hmm.
contributing to this planet in a more transcendent kind of way? I think that it's that parallel process of for the teachers and the students. So I think there are ways to do it. I think it happens with conversation,
Hmm.
but it happens with having people in the room that are able to have already made meaning in them for themselves about the importance of complexity and all that, and they're able to authentically embody it, to those around them.
You know,
Go ahead,
I
Drew.
got the opportunity to take my daughter who's 16, down. She plays soccer. She plays club soccer. We have season tickets for Racing FC here in Louisville, and we got a chance to go watch one of their practices. And I help coach as well, and coach for a number of years. And it struck me, one of the conversations and sort of arguments, disagreements that I have with a lot of science learning people is they will use athletics and
Mhm.
sports as a perfect example of why explicit instruction. You wouldn't just let them discover how to do this and how to do this and how to do this. And that I thought this is a really good example and maybe analogy of how we could use in the classroom. And the inquiry piece, I think, is helps with some of that disengagement, right?
Mhm.
And that meaning making kind of thing, both for students and for teachers. So you wouldn't say, let's see if you can figure out how to pass or how to, do whatever. You would do drills and you give explicit instruction on those specific things, right? But you would, if you're a great coach and saw this today, like, okay, so how can we move as a collective, move the defense and get the defense to move here, and then so that we can move the ball here, and then have a shot to score.
Mhm.
Now, that's an inquiry that frames it. You've got a collective effort. Ostensibly, the soccer team is really wanting to do that, right? And motivation there is not hard to find. In a classroom, it might be a little tougher, but while they're collaboratively trying to get this accomplished on the soccer field, the coaches were then giving explicit instruction and helping them giving move here, move here, ball here, all those kinds of things. So working in concert with one another, with a sort of motivating question, as it were, to then get them to really engage both of the teacher or the coaches were doing both of those kinds of things. What a great example, right? And in a social studies classroom, you
Mhm.
might ask a question was, does the executive branch have more power now than it should have? Then you could say, well, what would we need to know? And we could collaboratively work on that and then build in those kinds of explicit instruction kinds of things that
Mhm.
would be necessary and good teaching. We wouldn't just say, let's see if you can figure it out, right? I mean, you could, but you probably wouldn't get very far, and you would, if you got there, it'd take a long time to get there. So, to me, that inquiry framing can be
Mhm.
such a really powerful lever to get that disengagement lever or that dynamic sort of toned down, and then really engage in the thinking because it's perhaps hopefully more interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, and what you're both talking about is inquiry about the learner, right? Like actually talking to kids, actually talking to young athletes, figuring out what works. And I would add, Drew, that the best coaches that I ever observed, well, they wouldn't ask people to figure out how to run complicated plays without some direct instruction. One of the
Mhm.
first things they'll do at the start of the season is say, let me see you run a 40. Let me see you block and tackle.
Mhm.
Let me see you throw a ball. Let me see you catch a ball, right? They do some diagnostic inquiry about the talent of their players before they start figuring out who are we going to put where? And I think that immediately conveys meaning to the kid, right? My coach is trying
Mhm.
to get to know me, figure out where
Mhm.
I belong
Mhm.
in a way that we rarely do as educators. Dana, I wanted to toss it over to you because I'm curious what you would say about this disengagement problem. And we've talked a lot about making meaning, and that's a protocol we like to use a lot. I'm just curious if you wanted to add anything about the importance of making meaning.
So, I think that the issue stems from the fact that teachers are most comfortable with what they can predict. And I can predict when there is a right answer. I know what's right, I know what's wrong.
Mhm.
If we move them into Drew talked about the what if situation, we start to see a little bit of uncomfortableness, but you can push a few teachers in that direction. When we get them to the point, or when we try to push them to the point where we want them to start asking the how can we questions, that's when it gets really uncomfortable for them because there isn't necessarily a right answer. It depends
Mhm.
on the time, the context, the situation at hand, whatever team you're playing, that kind of thing. And I think that perhaps part of the issue becomes that we've quit, and you may disagree with this one, we've quit treating schools like a business. And I think that what we need to go back to is that, we're in the business of producing learners who can solve the problems of tomorrow. And until we start
Mm.
thinking that way and maybe start reading some business focused books instead of education focused books, like Simon
Mhm.
Sinek's Start with Why,
Mhm.
some of the best books that I've read, Think Again, Adam Grant, right, that
Mhm.
aren't necessarily education focused books, have the most complex ways of thinking that we can translate into the classroom. And we have to get teachers more comfortable with that approach versus the here's the right answer, here's the exact rubric, this is what I need to find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a great point. And as we start to wrap up, feel free to comment, Stephanie or Drew. But I'm also curious if there is a book that you would recommend to our audience that might help with bridging this gap between engagement and discouragement, right? That we've been talking about. Um,
I
For
would
me, oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, David Yeager, his book 10 to 25, How to Motivate Young People. He brings a lot of neuroscience into it. And yeah, it's about keeping demands high, but keeping the support high, and our appraisal of stress and mistakes and things like that. That would be very high recommendation for me.
okay.
And mine will be a little less neuroscientist-y, a little more education-y. Speaking of making meaning, Ron Richards, I think it's about cultures of thinking. I think it's 10 ways to get to cultures of thinking.
Mm.
Don't remember the title exactly, but the Project Zero, the Harvard
Yep.
folks, those thinking routines, which making meaning is one of those thinking routines. Really great work and tools, and they've got some new videos out, by the way, so
Hmm.
should definitely check those out.
Yeah.
And
And
I do want to just
go.
mention too, like what Dana was just saying about the solving of a problem. I think that whenever that is engaged, and I really love the work by, she's from USC, Dr. Mary Helen Imordino Yang, getting especially these generations now to think about civic reasoning, that kind of problem, and really also what makes them angry, what pisses them off,
Mhm.
what frustrates them, and I feel like that there's some juice that starts to happen, and the neurochemicals start to change for that in a good way.
Yeah. Well,
I
that's
Can
a,
do
you
have a
imagine?
question.
go ahead, Drew.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, can you imagine walking into a group of, high schoolers, even ninth graders, and just saying, what pisses you off? And start.
Yep. How ready they would be to answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that cognitive dissonance. Yeah, Stephanie, I'm curious, and if you'll indulge me in a question, I'm curious from a neuroscience. I've been thinking a lot about critical thinking, and I'm curious if because one of the things that I have heard a lot about is that critical thinking is domain specific and is not transferable. And again, I think that's Daniel Willingham's work. I tend to, it made me think of when we were talking about problem solving,
Hmm.
which I think is really, really great leverage, and gets into a lot of critical thinking or deeper learning, that kind of thing. How do you characterize critical thinking from a neuroscientist perspective? And is there a difference between domain specific critical thinking and, something like more, I would say more generalized?
Well, I mean, I think my terminology is probably different than yours. And for me, the in terms of the critical thinking, where I have gone with it in terms of research, is more on the systems thinking kind of
Hmm.
approach
Yeah.
of how things are connected, and we would call that transcendent. And when it comes to like the layers that go into the brain in a sense, or the systems that get activated in the brain, that the research is showing, and so this is a little bit less maybe specifically critical thinking, but transcendent type of thinking is going beyond the here and now, but it involves the default mode network, which is very autobiographical. There's personal relevance to things. Then there's the salience network, which has to do with whether things are actually relevant. And then your executive control, and being able to switch to toggle between these systems is part of what, like the higher the connectivity of those systems, the better the outcomes for the learners in terms of life type of resilience, like not just in academics, but different life outcomes over studying teens for 10, 20 years. So to me, when I hear critical thinking, my mind just mainly goes to transcendent and systems thinking, actually. So that's where
Interesting.
my mind goes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks.
those are certainly good directions to go. And I'm just going to suggest that, Drew, maybe you need to have Stefanie on your podcast to
No,
further
I would.
deepen the conversation because it would certainly be interesting. I think we have tackled a real world problem today. The disengagement of our youth in schools is chronic post-pandemic, right? The pandemic certainly hurt it. The retrenchment to more traditional teaching modes after the pandemic in the name of learning loss has exacerbated that. And I can't imagine a teacher who's not interested in the joy of discovering why students are engaged in learning and trying to further more of that. But I know the system makes it very, very hard to do that because of all the things that have to be accomplished in such a short amount of time. I want to thank you both for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening for this conversation. I do feel encouraged by it at the end of it because what I see is people working in different directions who are able to make that transference, that connection at a higher level, even though we're talking from different backgrounds. And that I want to encourage Drew's comment about the power of discussion as a solution to the kind of work that we need to do in schools. And those discussions are not only between coaches and teachers, but also teachers with their learners and learners with members of their community, because I think that's where the meaning will really start to come. I'm going to give the last word to Dana. If you have anything you want to add, Dana.
You know, Stephanie was talking about toward the middle of the conversation about the illusion of control, and
Mhm.
that illusion of control means less effort, and perhaps that illusion of control has led to some of the disillusionment that we've
Mm.
had in terms of, whether we're on the outside looking in or we're teachers that are just throwing up our hands and the students don't want to learn or they can't learn and the students are disillusioned with the whole system. And so, maybe if we can get rid of the illusion of control that we have, and the less effort that it requires, perhaps some of that upfront
Mm,
effort that we put in will create a more of a discovery type classroom in which our learners are solving those real world problems and are buying into, what
yeah.
we're trying to sell them.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for a great conversation, and we'll see you all again for DisEd 10 in November.